Before we look into the concepts of AI and GenAI, I gotta admit something. Over the last 3 decades, we have built up fairly complex communication systems with layers of complexity over complexity, with every generation coming over each other. And with the infusion of cloud adoption, and specifically this 5G first wave adoptions, we don't see the complexity to go away. We are also seeing enormous amount of data that's coming out of various subsystems of the networks that needs to be harnessed. So when we are talking about simplifying these networks, harnessing all that data that lives out around in the network, we started to believing in a concept in Nokia where we think the network needs a paradigm of sense, think, and act. Sensing from observability, especially when you're born in cloud this time around, you got to have the ingestion points across access, networks, and operations aspects. The think aspect that will be brought in by AI and generative AI models, where you apply all these data to these algorithmic science and get the thinking part of the network right, and act, and that's where autonomous operations comes very critical, where you have this 360-degree loop to bring back that thinking part back into the network in a feedback loop fashion. So for us, this autonomous operations and the use of AI and GenAI tool becomes very, very critical for the simplification journey of these future networks. You know, the way we see it in Nokia, it's a 2-level journey. One is with the conception of cloud and cloud-native architectures, there is an obvious way of scaling in, scaling out, dynamism, agility that needs to be brought in with just by the nature of cloud-native architectures. We are still early onto that journey. So that's, to me, is the bottom-up automation. How do we do lifecycle management better? How do we do continuous integration into these cloud systems better? That still we need to progress in the next 12, 18 months. And then the bigger question for us is, how do we make these networks more relevant to enterprises and industries? That elusive concept of monetizing these networks. And that's where we believe that automation and autonomous operations top-down, where you take the business intent of these verticals and translate these business intent into service intent, and eventually to the application of this multi-domain, multi-vendor network is going to be critical. So you see these 2 dimensions of automations are coming into play. And when you bring in these 2 automation dimensions, you see enormous amount of data. Service data, business data, network operations data, cloud infrastructure data, and that's where generative AI and AI play a sizable role. Let's talk about traditional AI, which is more a predictable model, time series. We're talking about algorithmic in models. We start up with the data science, take the data, raw data, curated data, all these ingestion points from the networks, and we build a data science practice. That's critical to us. And then we apply it to these models, train and retrain them, and possibly take out some predictable outcomes. So that's the traditional AI model. What's happening with large language models, and more specifically transformational models, whether they are working on language aspects of it or in the scenarios of graphic with computer visions, what we are seeing is they are becoming more and more relevant to the simplification journey of the network. Why I say that? What we need to do with networks, we need to make networks more conversational in nature. What I mean by conversational is take that business intent and how do you translate that simple business intent to a very complex network implementation. And that's how conversational aspects needs to be built in using large language models and generative AI frameworks to this simplification journey of the networks of the future. And that's where we believe that these 2 models will work synergistically, all both founded in the principles of data science. To understand some of the challenges, we've got to understand the generative AI framework in itself, which is essentially, from our perspective, is laid out in 4 strategic pillars. One part of it starts up with data and data science. And when you take these generic models out there or closed or open models, how do you augment right telco data and data science practice into these models? That becomes one critical challenge. So one has to start thinking about building data vectorization practice, taking the right data, relevant data, network, real-time, near real-time data, and augmenting it into these models so that you can get the right responses. So that's one first challenge, building data science practices. Second aspect is about prompt engineering, as they say it in generative AI. You got to be refining your engagement and interactions with the model, and that's where the whole prompt engineering science comes into play. Hallucination management is a third challenge. Often you see these models comes out with very sophisticated and very polished answers, and often they are wrong. And it's largely depends on both the aspect of data science built behind these models, as well as how do you do prompt engineering practices behind it. So both needs to be catered. And then there are practices of RAG, as they call it in generative AI, that also helps in hallucination management. That needs to be looked at. The fourth and the most critical piece, we believe, is all about people and skills. While we could be looking at all the technology factors out here, until unless we start thinking about how do we upskill and reskill all these telecommunications professionals that we have into this data science practice and prompt engineering, we're not going to cross that hill up there, right? So I believe, these needs to be tackled. What's beautiful about this technology is this time around, the telecommunications and the communications vertical is at par with the other verticals and other industries because everyone is seeing the unfolding of this technology at the same time, unlike the cloud native journey, unlike the APIs journey. So we believe telcos has got a unique opportunity out here, especially when the networks are living, breathing with real-time and near real-time data in enormous fashions. Three aspects that comes to my mind. Let's talk about multimodal frameworks. That's quite hot out of the press for generative AI frameworks. We have seen the outcomes of text and text generation with large language models. We have seen science of computer vision, which talks about video and visuals and generation of visual to text. What we are now seeing a breakthrough is the blending of text, video, and pictures to more constructive outcomes. And trust me, it has got a lot of relevance for the networks and network operators because multimodalities exist in every part of the network. The second aspect, which is sort of a shortcoming from our perspective when it comes to traditional AI or Gen AI models, is the lack of reasoning behind the outcomes. And higher level reasoning is one area where we are looking into quite a bit. Causal frameworks, what if analysis. All these are very critical, especially when you are building up high resilient and reliable networks. You got to do what if analysis. And if you could create that digital twin and do higher reasoning framework out there, that excites me quite a bit. Last, but the most critical piece that excites me is the unfolding of these open source models out there. The open source communities, those vibrant large language models and multimodal frameworks, they are coming out really fast. And we are very excited about it. We are experimenting half a dozen models out there in our labs, and we believe there's a lot of promise these models holds for us. As Nokia, to be very humble, we know a lot about the networks over our transformation journey for the last 3 decades, and we have been pushing ourselves into cloud, into SaaS, into API economies. As I quoted earlier, we have hundreds and thousands of projects that are being rolled out worldwide. We are sitting on an enormous wealth of telco and telco-specific data, whether it relates to building of the network. I'm talking about radios, overlays, underlays, core networks, operations, analytics, or about rolling out and manageability and operations of the network. So it's an enormous amount of data that we are sitting on. What we are looking at Nokia is how do we take this data and the data science around it and augment it into these large language models so that more relevant outcomes come out, not only for Nokia, but for the industry and a vertical as a whole. We have started to explore this journey not only with Nokia as a vendor, but also looking for partnership with communication service providers who are also very adamant to take this tool and solve some of the foundational autonomous operation challenges that we are seeing out there in the network. We at Nokia take security and privacy as one of the founding principles of how we build, manage, operate our networks. And when you talk about generative AI models, there is a lot of talk about, as we call, ethical AI practices. How do we make sure that anonymizing data and privacy aspects, and specifically when we know that security and privacy aspects are very, very specific to different geographies of the world, how do you take into consideration when you're building such generic models? So we are very conscious about it. This practice of ours starts right from the data science aspects of it, as we started to look at network data, operations data, analytics data that's coming out from real time and near real time. Anonymizing data and building trust and privacy on this data becomes a first and foremost design principle for us. Then on top of it, how do we use these tools in a more constructive fashion, solving those autonomous operations challenges to take the cost out of the network? How do we help monetize the data on the network? How do we build this future forward network more agile to cater to these verticals, as I keep talking about, and make more network relevant in a more responsible way is one of the critical thinking that we are doing. And whatever we do, that becomes our founding design principles of these new age networks.